My name is Julian Richmond, and I'm 30 years old. This happened in October, deep in Chippewa National Forest, Minnesota. I was alone on what was supposed to be a week-long research trip for my job as a wildlife biologist. What I experienced out there is something I still can't explain. I'm sharing this because someone needs to hear it. Someone needs to know the truth about what's in those woods. I had driven my RV up to a remote site near Pemmy Lake, far from the usual tourist trails. The air was cool and crisp, the kind of weather that made me feel alive. I'd been studying declining wolf populations in the area and had planned to set up motion-triggered cameras along the trails. Wolves were elusive, but I'd always had patience. Alone time in the wilderness was something I craved, and it had never bothered me before. But from the moment I arrived, something felt wrong. The first night was uneventful, though colder than I expected. I woke in the middle of the night to silence, not the usual peaceful stillness of the woods, but an oppressive, unnatural silence, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I brushed it off. Maybe I was just jumpy from the long drive, but the feeling lingered. The second night, my RV's generator failed. I had plenty of fuel, but it simply wouldn't turn on. I fiddled with it for hours to no avail, eventually resorting to candles and my headlamp. The darkness outside pressed against the windows, thick and heavy. Around midnight, I heard it for the first time, a low growl, distant but distinct. It wasn't the howl of a wolf or the bark of a coyote. It was deeper, almost guttural. I grabbed my flashlight and peered out into the trees, but the beam barely penetrated the shadows. Nothing moved. Probably just a bear, I muttered to myself, though my voice sounded hollow in the quiet. The next morning, I found tracks near my campsite. They were massive, clawed prints sunk deep into the earth. At first, I thought they belonged to a bear, but the spacing was all wrong, too far apart, as if whatever made them walked on two legs. Later that day, I met Henry. I'd gone for a hike to clear my head and stumbled upon his RV, parked in a small clearing about a mile away. He was outside chopping wood, his grizzled face set in a permanent scowl. "Didn't think anyone else was camped this far out," I said, trying to sound casual. Henry looked up, his eyes sharp and wary. "Not many people. Too quiet out here for most folks." I laughed nervously. "That's why I like it." He sat down his axe and wiped his hands on his pants. "You shouldn't be here," he said bluntly. I frowned. "Why not?" Henry glanced toward the trees, his expression darkening. "This forest? It's not right. People vanish out here, hear things they shouldn't. You do well to pack up and leave." I wanted to ask more, but his tone made it clear he wasn't interested in conversation. Still, his words stuck with me as I made my way back to my campsite. That night, things escalated. I woke to a strange sound, like someone whispering just outside the RV. My heart pounded as I strained to listen, but the whisper stopped abruptly, replaced by the same low growl I'd heard the night before. This time, it was closer, much closer. I grabbed the hunting knife I always kept by my bed and slowly opened the RV door. The forest was pitch black, the moon hidden behind thick clouds. My flashlight's beam flickered as I swept it across the campsite. That's when I saw them. Eyes. Dozens of them, glowing faintly in the darkness just beyond the tree line. They were too high off the ground to be wolves, and too far apart to be anything I could recognize. My breath caught, and I stumbled back inside, slamming the door shut. The next morning, I found Sasha. I'd driven into the forest further than I should have, hoping to outrun whatever was happening. Instead, I came across her, alone, sitting on a rock near a trailhead, her backpack slung over one shoulder. "Are you okay?" I asked, pulling over. Sasha looked up, her face pale and streaked with dirt. "I'm lost," she said, her voice shaking. "I've been walking for hours. I can't find the trail back." I offered her a ride, and she climbed into the passenger seat, clutching her pack like a lifeline. She seemed jittery, her eyes darting toward the trees as if she expected something to jump out at any moment. "What happened?" I asked as we drove. Sasha hesitated, then whispered, "I heard someone calling my name. I thought it was my brother, but he wasn't here. I kept hearing it, though, over and over." That night, the Wendigo came. Henry had warned me earlier that day when we ran into him again. "It's the hunger," he said, his voice low and grim. "That thing preys on the lonely, the lost. You hear it calling your name. You don't answer. You see it in the trees. You run. I didn't understand how literal his warning was until it was too late. Sasha and I had parked near a ranger station, hoping to find help in the morning. We were both exhausted, but neither of us could sleep. The air was bitterly cold, colder than it should have been for October. Frost coated the inside of the RV windows, and the whispers started again. Julian, my name faint but insistent, came from the woods. Don't listen, Sasha hissed, her eyes wide with fear. I nodded, gripping the knife tightly. The whispers grew louder, joined by the sound of branches snapping and leaves crunching. And then we saw it. The creature was emaciated, its limbs impossibly long, its pale skin stretched tight over its bones. Its face was a grotesque mask with hollow eyes that seemed to pierce straight through me. It stood at the edge of the clearing, its head tilting slowly as it watched us. Run, I whispered, pushing Sasha toward the door. We bolted into the forest, the Wendigo's guttural growl echoing behind us. It moved unnaturally fast, its movements jerky and inhuman. Henry saved us, or tried to. He appeared out of nowhere, his rifle aimed squarely at the creature. Go, he shouted. I'll hold it off. We didn't argue. Sasha and I ran, the sound of gunshots ringing out behind us, but the growls didn't stop. When we reached the RV, Henry was gone. There was no sign of him, no sound but the wind rustling through the trees. Sasha and I escaped the forest the next morning, driving straight to the nearest ranger station. The rangers didn't believe us, of course. They wrote it off as stress or exhaustion, questioning, saying Henry had likely been attacked by a bear. But I know the truth. Some nights, when the wind howls outside my window, I hear it again, my name whispered in the dark, and I know it's still out there, waiting for me to come back. My name is Hannah Alvarez, and I'm 32 years old. This happened last summer during what I thought would be just another adventure to fuel my travel blog. I've spent the better part of my career exploring hidden gems and offbeat places, but nothing, not even the ghost tours in Savannah or the creepy hotels in New Orleans, could have prepared me for Enchanted Rock. I pulled my RV into the campsite just before noon. Enchanted Rock rose in the distance, a massive pink granite dome that glowed faintly under the Texas sun. I'd been here once as a kid, but I couldn't remember much beyond the climb and my mom yelling at me to stay close. This time, I was alone, and I planned to capture every bit of its beauty. After parking in a secluded spot, I grabbed my camera and gear, excited to scout the area. The plan was simple: hike to the summit, take some photos, and interview a few locals about the legends. The place had plenty of them: ancient curses, ghostly sightings, and strange disappearances. Perfect fodder for a post that would rake in clicks. I checked in at the visitor center, where I met Maggie, a park ranger who looked to be in her late 50s. She wore a wide-brimmed hat and had a weathered face that reminded me of an old cowboy movie. "First time here?" she asked, her tone friendly but measured. "First time as an adult," I said, smiling. "I'm a travel writer, and I wanted to cover some of the stories about the rock. You know, the spooky stuff." Her expression shifted slightly. "It's a beautiful place, but you need to respect it, especially after dark." "Why? Is it really haunted?" I teased. She hesitated before answering. "There are things here older than you can imagine. The Tonkawa people believe this was a sacred site. They say a warrior cursed it before he died. I've seen enough strange things to believe there's truth to it." I laughed nervously. "Well, I'm not planning to anger any spirits." Her gaze lingered on me, her eyes serious. "Just don't wander too far off, and if you hear drumming, go the other way." I dismissed her warning as local folklore meant to entertain tourists, but as I hiked up the trail, I couldn't shake the feeling that the rock was watching me. The path twisted through clusters of boulders and dry scrub, the air hot and still. Occasionally I'd hear a bird or the rustle of a lizard darting through the brush, but otherwise it was unnervingly quiet. About halfway up, I noticed something strange, symbols etched into the granite. They were rough and jagged, like they'd been scratched in haste, and they didn't look like anything I'd seen before. I snapped a few photos, thinking they'd make for a good mystery in my blog. Then, for no reason I could explain, a chill ran down my spine. It was the middle of the day, blazing hot, but the air felt cold and heavy. I brushed it off as nerves and kept climbing. When I reached the summit, the view was breathtaking. The horizon stretched endlessly, the land below dotted with patches of green and the occasional shimmer of water. I set up my tripod and began taking pictures, losing myself in the work. That's when I heard it, a faint drumming sound carried on the wind. I froze, my heart thudding in my chest. It wasn't loud, just a low, steady rhythm, but it seemed to come from all around me. Maggie was just trying to spook you, I muttered, shaking my head, but the sound didn't stop. If anything, it got louder, more insistent. I packed up quickly and started back down the trail, my nerves on edge. The shadows seemed darker now, the shapes of the rocks more menacing. I told myself I was imagining things, that there was a rational explanation for the sound. Maybe someone was drumming at the base of the rock, but deep down, I knew better. That night, I stayed in my RV editing the photos I'd taken. They were stunning, capturing the eerie beauty of the landscape perfectly. But when I scrolled through the shots of the summit, I stopped cold. In one of the pictures taken at the edge of the overlook, there was a figure. It was faint, barely visible, but unmistakably there. A tall, yet shadowy shape that hadn't been there when I snapped the shot. I stared at the screen, my stomach twisting. Was it a trick of the light, a glitch in the camera? I tried to rationalize it, but the memory of that drumming filled my mind, and suddenly I didn't feel so alone. The first knock came around midnight, soft, tentative, like someone tapping on the side of the RV. My blood turned to ice. I froze, listening. It came again, louder this time, followed by a scraping sound, like nails dragging across metal. Grabbing a flashlight, I moved to the window and peered outside. The campsite was empty, nothing but shadows and the faint outline of the trees. Then I saw it, etched into the side of the RV, that same symbol I'd seen on the rock earlier that day. My hands trembled as I stepped back, my mind racing. Someone was messing with me. They had to be. But deep down, I knew this wasn't a prank. The next morning, I drove to town and asked around about the symbols. Most people didn't recognize them, but an older man at a coffee shop told me they looked like warnings used by the Tonkawa. They marked sacred places, he said, places where the spirits were restless. The word restless stuck with me. On a whim, I stopped by the visitor center and found Maggie. When I told her what had happened, she frowned deeply. "You need to leave," she said, her voice firm. "The rock isn't just a place, it's alive, and you've drawn its attention." "Attention?" I repeated, my stomach sinking. "You've disturbed something that doesn't want to be disturbed." I didn't leave. I should have, but my curiosity and my pride kept me there. That night, the drumming returned, louder and closer than before. The air inside the RV felt suffocating, thick with an invisible weight. I tried to sleep but kept waking to strange noises, footsteps circling the RV, faint whispers just outside the door. Around 3 a.m. I couldn't take it anymore. Grabbing my flashlight, I stepped outside, determined to confront whatever or whoever was tormenting me. The campsite was shrouded in darkness, the trees casting long, jagged shadows as I shone the light around. I spotted something near the edge of the clearing, an altar of stones arranged in a circle. In the center was a bundle of feathers and bones, tied with twine. My breath caught. The drumming grew louder, echoing in my ears, and then I saw him, the shadowy figure from my photo. He stood just beyond the altar, his form shifting and flickering like smoke. "You're not real," I whispered, backing away. "This isn't real." But then he moved, stepping closer. His eyes burned with an unnatural light, and the air grew colder with each step. I stumbled, falling to the ground, and the flashlight rolled out of my hand. "Leave!" A voice hissed, deep and guttural, reverberating through the clearing. Scrambling to my feet, I ran back to the RV, slamming the door behind me. The drumming stopped, leaving a deafening silence in its wake. At dawn, I packed up and left without looking back. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the figure standing on the summit, watching me. I've written about many places since then, but I'll never return to Enchanted Rock. Some things are meant to remain untouched, their stories told in whispers and warnings. And if you ever visit, take Maggie's advice. If you hear drumming, go the other way. My name is Grayson Gomez, and I'm 27 years old. This happened last October when I took my RV to Red Lake Petland in Minnesota for a solo trip. I'm a freelance travel writer and photographer, and I was chasing a story about one of the most untouched, eerie landscapes in the country. I thought it would be just another job, a chance to snap some photos, write a poetic description of misty bogs, and call it a day. I couldn't have been more wrong. I arrived at the edge of the bog in the late afternoon. The narrow dirt road leading to the campsite was rougher than I expected, and the RV's tires sank slightly in the damp, muddy ground. The air felt heavy, laden with the smell of decaying vegetation and stagnant water. I parked where the road widened into a makeshift lot, unable to get closer to the marked trails. My plan was to hike in with my camera gear and come back to the RV to write notes at night. The first thing I noticed was the silence. No birdsong, no rustling leaves, no wind, just an oppressive stillness, broken only by the occasional squelch of my boots in the mud. I dismissed the unease gnawing at me and focused on setting up my camera. The light filtering through the mist was perfect, soft and golden, illuminating the strange, otherworldly beauty of the bog. I ventured deeper, snapping shots of twisted trees, moss-covered hummocks, and pools of water that mirrored the pale sky. That's when I saw it. Hanging from a branch ahead was a small doll, crudely made of sticks and wrapped in dirty fabric. It swayed slightly, though there was no breeze. I stopped and stared at it, the hair on the back of my neck standing up. It looked like some kind of voodoo charm, but this wasn't Louisiana. It was Minnesota. Just local kids messing around? Deaf, I muttered, though the words didn't make me feel any better. I took a photo of it for context and kept walking. The mist thickened as the sun sank lower. I'd planned to head back before dark, but the trail seemed to twist and shift, leading me in circles. My GPS showed me moving in the right direction, yet I kept passing the same tree with the hanging doll. The logical part of my brain told me I was tired and misreading the landmarks, but a deeper, instinctual part of me felt watched. The first whisper came as I stopped to check my map. Grayson, my name, faint and drawn out, drifted through the mist. I froze, my breath catching. "Hello?" I called, turning in a slow circle. My flashlight beam cut through the fog, illuminating nothing but trees and water. "Grayson," it came again from a different direction, closer this time. My pulse quickened. There wasn't supposed to be anyone else out here. The parking lot was empty when I arrived, and the nearest ranger station was miles away. I packed up my gear in record time and retraced my steps as best I could, refusing to look back at the whispering voice. By the time I reached the RV, the mist had swallowed the entire area. I locked the door behind me, pulled the curtains shut, and turned on every light I had. I told myself it was just my imagination, a mix of fatigue and isolation playing tricks on me. But when I reviewed the photos I'd taken, my stomach sank. Half the images were distorted, warped by static-like streaks that hadn't been visible in my viewfinder. In one shot, the photo of the doll, there was something else behind it. Half shrouded in the mist stood a figure, a woman, her face obscured by a tangle of dark hair, her body draped in rags. She was turned toward the camera, her head tilted at an unnatural angle. I shut my laptop and poured myself a stiff drink, telling myself it was a trick of the light, a quirk of the lens. But the image was burned into my mind. The next morning, I decided to venture into town. The air outside was heavy and damp, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. As I pulled out of the lot, an elderly woman flagged me down from the side of the road. She wore a long coat and a knit hat, her face lined with age, but her eyes sharp. I rolled down my window, and she leaned in, her gaze piercing. "You've been to the bog," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," I replied uneasily. "I'm working on a story." She frowned, shaking her head. "You shouldn't be out there. That place isn't safe. It's cursed." I stiffened. "Cursed? You mean the doll I found?" Her eyes widened. "You touched it?" "No, I just photographed it." The woman crossed herself and muttered something under her breath. "The witch doesn't like to be disturbed," she said. "She'll make sure you don't leave." Before I could ask what she meant, she walked away, vanishing into the mist. By the time I returned to the bog that afternoon, the air was colder, the silence even more oppressive. My GPS worked fine in town but became unreliable again as soon as I parked. I decided to stick close to the trail this time, but that didn't stop the whispers. Grayson. They came from every direction, each one more insistent than the last. I tried to ignore them, focusing on my work. But then I saw her. The figure from the photograph stood in the distance, her silhouette barely visible through the mist. She didn't move, but seemed to watch me, her presence pulling at something deep and primal in my chest. "Who are you?" I shouted, my voice trembling. She didn't answer. Instead, she raised a hand and pointed toward the water. Against my better judgment, I followed her gesture, stepping closer to the edge of the bog. The water was dark, reflecting nothing, and as I stared, shapes began to form beneath the surface. Faces, distorted, anguished, their mouths open in silent screams. I stumbled back, my heart pounding. When I looked up, the figure was gone. The final straw came that evening. I was packing up my gear when a young man stumbled out of the mist, his face pale and panicked. "Are you Grayson?" he asked, his voice shaking. "Yes," I said wearily. "Who are you?" "Zach. I'm an intern at the park. I came to check on you after Ruby. The old lady in town said you might be in trouble." I didn't know whether to feel relieved or more unnerved. Zach was friendly enough, but he seemed spooked, constantly glancing over his shoulder. "We shouldn't stay here," he said. "The stories, they're true. People disappear in this bog. You need to leave." I nodded, grateful for the company, and we started back toward the RV. But the mist thickened, swallowing the trail entirely. The whispers returned, louder now, overlapping and chaotic. Zach froze. "Did you hear that?" Before I could answer, a shadow moved in the corner of my vision. The woman stepped out of the mist, her hollow eyes locking onto Zach. He screamed as she lunged toward him, her form twisting and stretching unnaturally. "Run!" Zach shouted, and I didn't hesitate. I sprinted through the mist, my heart hammering. The whispers were deafening now, accusing me, pleading with me. "Why did you leave me, Grayson?" One voice cried, eerily familiar. I stumbled into the parking lot, gasping for breath. The RV was right where I'd left it, and I fumbled with the keys, desperate to get inside. As I started the engine, I glanced back toward the trail. The woman stood at the edge of the lot, her rags billowing in an unseen wind. She didn't move, but I could feel her hatred, her hunger, as if she was willing me to step out. I slammed the door shut and sped away, the mist chasing me until I hit the main road. I never went back to Red Lake Petland, but the bog never left me. The photos I took that week are distorted beyond recognition, except for one. It's a clear shot of the woman standing in the water, her eyes fixed on the camera. Sometimes, late at night, I hear her voice. It's faint, but it's always there, whispering my name, and I know deep down that the bog is still waiting for me to return. My name is Julian Moody, and I'm 35 years old. This happened in July when my wife Lila, our 12-year-old daughter Kara, and my younger brother Matt decided to camp in Paul Bunyan State Forest, Minnesota. What started as a peaceful family getaway turned into a nightmare, one I still wake from in a cold sweat, hearing Kara's voice calling from the woods. It was my idea to camp there. I'd read about its rugged trails and unspoiled beauty, a perfect escape from our busy lives. Lila agreed, eager to sketch the landscape, and Kara couldn't wait to explore. Matt was a wild card, an adrenaline junkie who loved mocking my love for careful planning. I should have known better. I'd heard stories about Devil's Hollow, an area deep within the forest with an evil reputation, but I dismissed them as local legend. I shouldn't have. We arrived mid-morning on a Friday. The air was crisp, the trees tall and majestic, and the drive-in had been uneventful. The dirt road leading to our campsite wound through dense woods, the kind that seemed to whisper when the wind blew. Our spot was secluded, with just enough space for our RV and Matt's pop-up tent. After setting up, Kara immediately took off to explore, her curiosity as boundless as her energy. "Kara," I called after her. "Stay where we can see you." She waved me off. "I'm just looking at the trees, Dad." Lila gave me a look, part amused, part exasperated. "Let her be, Julian. She's 12, not 2. Matt chuckled. "Relax, big bro. What's the worst that could happen?" That night, the worst began. It started with a storm. Matt's cheap tent leaked like a sieve, so he ended up in the RV with us. He grumbled, blaming me for his misery because I'd picked the middle of nowhere for our trip. Lila ignored him, sketching by flashlight, and Kara lay curled up on the RV's bench seat, fast asleep. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of footsteps. At first, I thought it was Kara heading to the bathroom, but when I checked, she was still sleeping. The footsteps were outside, circling the RV, slow and deliberate. I froze, straining to hear over the pounding rain. "Do you hear that?" I whispered to Lila. She nodded, her eyes wide. "It's probably an animal," she said, though her voice wavered. Matt, oblivious, snored loudly from the bunk above. I grabbed a flashlight and opened the RV door, peering into the night. The beam cut through the rain, illuminating the campsite. Nothing. No movement, no sound but the rain. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching us. The next day, Kara found the dolls. She'd wandered off again while we prepared breakfast, her curiosity always getting the better of her. When she returned, she held a small wooden figure in her hand. It was crudely carved from some kind of dark wood, with exaggerated feet, eyes wide with fear, and a mouth twisted in a silent scream. "Look what I found," she said, grinning. Lila frowned. "Where did you get that?" "By the trail. There were a bunch of them, half buried in the dirt." "Can I keep it?" "No," I said too sharply. "Put it back where you found it." Kara's face fell. "It's just a doll." Lila placed a hand on her shoulder. "That's right, sweetheart. It's not ours to take." Grumbling, Kara trudged back to the trail. When she returned, she seemed distant, distracted. I told myself she was just sulking, but later, when I saw her drawing the doll in her notebook, I wondered if it had left more of an impression than she'd let on. The forest grew stranger the longer we stayed. Matt's GPS stopped working, and my phone's compass spun uselessly. Lila's watch froze at 3:17 p.m. Trails we'd followed easily on our first day seemed unfamiliar, their landmarks shifting. Kara started talking about an imaginary friend she'd met in the woods. "He's tall and funny," she said at dinner. "He knows all about the forest." Lila exchanged a glance with me. "What's his name?" she asked. "He didn't say," Kara replied, plowing at her food, "but he showed me a secret place. Can I go there tomorrow?" "No," I said firmly. "You're staying with us from now on." Kara rolled her eyes but didn't argue. That night I woke to the sound of laughter. It was faint, drifting through the trees, high-pitched and childlike. For a moment I thought it was Kara, but when I checked she was fast asleep. The laughter continued, distant yet unmistakable. By the third day I was ready to leave. The forest felt alive, its shadows darker, its silence heavier. Matt laughed off my concerns, calling me paranoid. "It's just the woods, Derek. You're letting your imagination run wild." But even he couldn't explain the claw marks we found on the RV that morning, long and deep, gouged into the metal. "Kara, did you see any animals around last night?" I asked. She shook her head. "No, but my friend says we shouldn't be here." "Your friend?" Lila asked sharply. "What did he say?" Kara hesitated. "He says this place isn't for us. He wants me to stay, though. He said I could play forever." My blood ran cold. "Kara, stop talking to this friend. He's not real." Her lip quivered. "He is real, and he's mad at you." That evening, Kara disappeared. We'd been packing up to leave when she wandered off again. I called her name until my throat was raw, my panic growing with each unanswered shout. Lila was hysterical, Matt uncharacteristically silent. We searched for hours, deeper into the woods than we'd ever gone. We found her at sunset, standing in the clearing, holding another wooden doll. Her face was blank, her eyes glassy. Lila ran to her, pulling her into a hug, but Kara didn't respond. She just stared ahead, unblinking. "She's fine," Matt said. "She probably just—" "Shut up, Matt," I snapped. "We need to get out of here, now." That night, the spirit came for us. Kara was tucked into the RV, her eyes still vacant. Lila and I stood watch, knives clutched in trembling hands. Around midnight, the footsteps returned, circling the RV, joined by laughter and whispers. "Julian." The voice was soft, familiar. It was Kara's voice, but Kara was inside the RV. The door rattled as if someone was trying to open it. Lila clutched my arm. "Don't let it in," she whispered. The rattling stopped, and the shadow appeared, a figure tall and thin, its limbs wrong, its face smooth and pale. It stared at us through the window, its head tilting unnaturally. "Go away," I shouted, brandishing the knife. The shadow didn't move. Then it spoke. "Stay with us, Kara. Play forever." My blood turned to ice. "You can't have her." The shadow melted into the darkness, but the laughter remained, growing louder, closer. I knew then we couldn't stay. The forest wanted Kara. It wouldn't stop until it had her. We fled to Devil's Hollow, the place Kara's friend had shown her. It was the only way to end this. The clearing was filled with wooden dolls, hundreds of them, each carved with a child's terrified face. Lila knelt, arranging a circle of salt and herbs, while I held Kara close. "Let them go!" Lila shouted into the night. "Release them!" The air grew icy, the laughter turning to screams. The shadow reappeared, larger now, its form twisting and shifting. It reached for Kara, but Lila stood her ground, chanting words I didn't understand. The shadow faltered, its edges blurring. Matt, ignoring my protests, grabbed one of the dolls and set it on fire. The flames roared to life, spreading to the others. The shadow let out an unearthly wail, its form collapsing into itself. The screams faded, the forest falling silent. Kara blinked, her expression clearing. "Dad," she whispered. "It's okay," I said, tears streaming down my face. "You're safe now." We left that night, vowing never to return. But the hollow stayed with us. Kara refuses to talk about her friend, though I've caught her drawing him, a tall, shadowy figure lurking in the background. Lila says we did the right thing, but I'm not so sure. The forest took something from us, something intangible but vital. Sometimes, late at night, I hear the laughter again. My name is Matthew Woodward. I'm 40 years old, and this happened in October of 2022. I've always loved exploring off-the-beaten-path destinations in my RV, documenting my trips for the travel blog I've been running for years. My niche is spooky or unusual locations, haunted campgrounds, forgotten ghost towns, that sort of thing. This time, my curiosity led me to Whitewater State Park in southeastern Minnesota. It's a beautiful place, all rolling bluffs, hardwood forests, and limestone cliffs, but it's also known for its Native American burial mounds and the strange stories surrounding them. Disappearances, sightings of ghostly figures, and warnings not to disturb the land. I thought I'd debunk the myths like I usually do. I couldn't have been more wrong. When I arrived at Whitewater, the weather was perfect. Crisp air, the trees glowing with red and gold leaves, and just enough breeze to make the woods feel alive. I parked my RV in a secluded spot near a trailhead, far enough from other campers to enjoy some peace and quiet. The first person I met was Jim Miller, a ranger who manned the visitor. He was in his mid-50s, stocky, with a sun-weathered face and sharp blue eyes. Jim struck me as one of those people who know everything there is to know about their patch of land. "You're here to write about the mounds, aren't you?" he said, eyeing the camera slung around my neck. I smiled. "You caught me." Jim frowned, leaning on the counter. "You do well to leave them alone. The mounds aren't just old dirt, they're sacred. And folks who mess with them, well, things tend to go wrong." "Things like what?" Jim hesitated, glancing out the window as if he expected someone to overhear. "Strange noises, people getting lost, sometimes worse. Last year, a college kid went missing after camping near Spirit's Rise. Never found a trace of him." I felt a chill but brushed it off. "I'll be careful." He sighed, then handed me a trail map. "Stick to the marked paths, and if you hear someone calling your name out there, don't answer." I laughed nervously. "Got it." The first day passed uneventfully. I hiked some trails, took photos of the river winding through the valley, and noted a few spots where I could set up my tripod for sunrise shots. By evening, I was back in my RV, cozy with a bowl of soup in my notes. That night, as I drifted off to sleep, I heard a soft tapping on the window. Tap, tap, tap. I sat up, my heart racing. My first thought was an animal, maybe a bird or a curious raccoon. But the tapping came again, louder this time, and when I glanced at the window, I swore I saw a faint shadow move across it. "Who's there?" I called out, fumbling for my flashlight. There was no reply, just the rustling of leaves outside. When I mustered the courage to peek out, there was nothing there. I told myself it was just the wind and went back to bed, though I barely slept. The next morning, I decided to hike to Spirit's Rise, the largest and most infamous burial mound in the park. Jim's warning noted at me, but I couldn't resist. If I wanted to write a good story, I needed photos. The trail was beautiful, but eerily quiet. No birds sang, no squirrels rustled through the underbrush. It was as though the forest itself was holding its breath. When I reached the mound, I was struck by its sheer presence. It wasn't just a hill, it felt alive, as though the ground was pulsing faintly beneath my feet. A ring of old oaks surrounded it, their twisted branches casting long shadows. I raised my camera to take a photo, but the screen flickered and went black. I muttered a curse, fiddling with the buttons, but it wouldn't turn back on. That's when I heard the whisper, "Matthew." It was faint, barely audible over the breeze, but unmistakable. My name. I spun around, searching for the source, but the trail was empty. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. No answer. Feeling a sudden wave of unease, I turned and hurried back down the trail, my boots crunching loudly on the gravel. But the further I walked, the more the path seemed to change. The twists and turns didn't match what I remembered. My GPS showed nothing but a spinning icon. By the time I found my way back to the RV, the sun was low in the sky, and my nerves were shot. I tried to shake off the fear, focusing instead on making dinner and organizing my notes. But that night, the knocking came again. Tap, tap, tap. This time it was on the door. I froze, gripping the edge of the table. "Who is it?" No reply, just another knock, louder this time. My hand trembled as I grabbed the flashlight and swung the door open. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing. The campsite was empty, the woods silent. As I backed into the RV, I noticed something chilling. A single handprint on the window, small, like that of a child. The next morning I sought out Jim, desperate for answers. He listened quietly as I described the whispers, the knocking, the handprint. "You went to Spirit's Rise, didn't you?" he said, his voice flat. I nodded, guilt bubbling in my chest. "You disturbed them," he said. "You've been marked." "Marked for what?" Jim shook his head. "The spirits protect the mounds. Sometimes they warn people to leave. Sometimes," he trailed off, his gaze distant, "you need to give something back, an offering, flowers, a token, anything to show respect." I didn't fully believe him, but what choice did I have? That evening, I returned to Spirit's Rise with a small bundle of wildflowers and an old bracelet that had belonged to my mother. I wasn't sure what to do, so I placed them at the base of the mound and murmured an apology. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the air grew heavy, and the whispers returned, louder this time, echoing through the trees. I turned to leave, but a figure blocked the path. It was a boy, no older than 10, with pale skin and hollow eyes. He stared at me, his mouth moving soundlessly. "Are you lost?" I managed to whisper. The boy didn't respond. Instead, he pointed to the mound, his expression blank. When I looked back at him, he was gone. That night, the activity escalated. I was jolted awake by a loud crash, as though something had struck the side of the RV. My flashlight flickered erratically as I scanned the interior. The air felt icy, my breath visible in the dim light. Then I saw him again. The boy stood in the corner of the RV, his head tilted at an unnatural angle. His lips moved, but no sound came out. When I stepped toward him, his face twisted into a horrifying scream, and he vanished, leaving behind a faint trail of frost. I knew I couldn't stay another night. At dawn, I packed up and tried to start the RV, but the engine wouldn't turn over. Panicking, I grabbed my map and decided to hike back to the visitor center, hoping to find Jim. But the forest had other plans. The trail warped around me, the trees pressing closer, their branches clawing at my jacket. The whispers became a cacophony, drowning out my thoughts. And then I saw it, a clearing filled with old belongings, rusted lanterns, broken tents, and even a weathered RV overtaken by moss. In the center stood a stone altar, dark and slick, as though something had recently been spilled there. The boy's voice cut through the chaos. "Help me." He stood by the altar, his pale hand reaching out. I wanted to run, but my feet carried me forward. As I approached, the air grew colder, and a shadow began to rise from the altar. It was tall, featureless, and radiating a malevolent energy that made my chest tighten. The boy disappeared, replaced by the shadow, which advanced on me, its form shifting like smoke. Heart pounding, I fumbled in my bag and pulled out the bracelet I brought earlier, holding it high. "I'm sorry, please take it," I shouted. The shadow paused, its form wavering. Slowly, it retreated, dissolving into the cold air. The whispers faded. When I stumbled back to the visitor center hours later, Jim was gone. Another ranger told me there hadn't been a Jim Miller on staff in years. A plaque near the entrance listed his name. He'd vanished in the woods decades ago, presumed dead. I left Whitewater that day, swearing never to return. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear the tapping. This happened in late November during the last stretch of a solo photography trip. I'll never forget it. My name is Grant Miller, and I'm 38 years old. I've spent most of my adult life chasing the perfect shot, the kind of photo that makes people stop and see the world differently. But over the last few years, the spark has been fading. The photographs all felt the same, and I started to wonder if my best work was behind me. That's why I went to Red Lake Wildlife Management Area, a sprawling wetland in northwestern Minnesota. I'd heard it was stunning, a place where nature seemed untouched by time. I wanted isolation, inspiration, and maybe a few shots to reinvigorate my portfolio. What I found instead was something I still can't explain. I pulled into the park late in the afternoon. The lot was empty except for a small, rusty sedan near the visitor kiosk. A middle-aged man with a worn jacket and a trucker cap stood leaning against it, sipping from a thermos. "You heading into the marshes?" he asked as I stepped out of my RV. His voice had a rough edge, the kind that comes from years of cigarettes or shouting into the wind. "Thinking about it," I said, grabbing my camera bag. He squinted at me, his lips pressing into a thin line. "Be careful out there. Strange things happen in those wetlands, especially this time of year." "What kind of strange things?" "The kind you don't want to meet. Ever hear about the devil's song?" I shook my head, half smiling. "Nope, but it sounds like the setup to a good campfire story." His expression didn't change. "It ain't a story. Folks around here know better than to listen. If you hear music, you walk the other way. And if you see something following you—" He trailed off, shaking his head. "Well, it's best not to see it at all." I laughed nervously, more out of politeness than amusement, and thanked him for the warning. As I drove into the park, his words lingered in my mind. I found a secluded spot near the wetlands to park the RV. The view was breathtaking, reeds swaying gently in the breeze, the golden light of sunset reflecting off the still water. The marsh stretched out like a painting, dotted with clusters of skeletal trees that reached for the sky like twisted fingers. I set up my gear and snapped a few photos. As the sun dipped lower, the camera felt good in my hands, familiar and grounding. For a moment I forgot about the man's warning and lost myself in the work. But as twilight deepened, the stillness of the marsh began to unnerve me. There was no wind, no chirping of crickets or rustling of small animals. Just an oppressive silence, broken only by the occasional splash of water too far away to see. That's when I heard it. A melody, soft and distant, drifting through the air like smoke. It was hauntingly beautiful, the kind of sound that pulls at something deep inside you. At first, I thought it was coming from a bird or maybe someone playing music at another campsite, but as I listened, I realized it wasn't coming from any one direction. It was all around me. I dismissed it as my imagination and went to bed early, but the melody followed me into my dreams. I woke in a sweat, the song echoing in my ears like the hum of a tuning fork. The next morning, I shook it off and decided to hike deeper into the marshes. If I could capture the stillness, the isolation of this place, maybe it would spark something in me. As I trudged through the reeds, the melody returned, faint but unmistakable. It sounded different this time, almost familiar. The further I walked, the clearer it became, weaving together fragments of music from my past. The lullaby my grandmother used to sing, the song my ex-wife played on repeat when we first started dating. By the time I reached a clearing in the wetlands, the melody had grown louder. It was no longer just a sound, it was a presence, pressing against me like an invisible hand. That's when I saw him. A figure stood at the edge of the clearing, tall and thin, with no discernible features. His form seemed to shimmer like heat rising off pavement. "Hello?" I called, my voice cracking. The figure didn't move. I fumbled for my camera, snapping a few shots to prove to myself later that this was real. But when I lowered the lens, the figure was gone. Back at the RV, I reviewed the photos. The figure wasn't there. Every shot showed the clearing exactly as it had been. Empty, desolate, untouched. That night, the melody grew louder. It didn't just float through the air this time. It invaded the RV, vibrating through the walls like the hum of a distant engine. I tried covering my ears, but it didn't help. Then the fog started. It rolled in thick and fast, wrapping around the RV until I couldn't see a foot beyond the windows. Shapes moved within it, flickering like shadows on a screen. My heart pounded as I caught glimpses of something tall and angular, circling the RV. I stayed inside all night, too scared to move. The next morning, I found footprints in the mud. They weren't mine. They were too large, too deep, as though something impossibly heavy had walked through the clearing. I decided to leave, but when I turned the key in the ignition, the engine sputtered and died. I tried again and again, but the RV wouldn't start. The melody swelled, a taunting, mocking sound that seemed to laugh at my frustration. With no other option, I grabbed my gear and headed back into the wetlands, hoping to find help or at least a signal for my phone. The deeper I went, the stranger things became. The reeds seemed taller, the water darker, the trees more gnarled. The air grew heavy, making each step feel like wading through thick mud. Eventually, I stumbled upon an abandoned hunting cabin, its roof sagging and windows shattered. Inside, I found a journal covered in mildew, the pages brittle with age. The entries were written in a shaky hand, detailing the story of a hunter who had come to the marshes decades ago. He'd heard the melody just as I had and followed it to its source, a deal with something he called the shadowman. The melody promised success, fame, everything the hunter desired, but the cost was his soul. The final entry read, "He follows me now. I hear the song every day. I am his, and soon you will be too." I heard a creak beak behind me and froze. Turning slowly, I saw the shadowman standing in the doorway. He was taller now, more solid, his featureless face tilted as though he were studying me. The melody swelled to a deafening crescendo as he stepped closer, his long, spindly fingers reaching out. "No!" I shouted, stumbling backward. I grabbed a flare from my bag and struck it. The red light cast eerie shadows across the cabin. The shadowman recoiled, his form flickering like a dying flame. Without thinking, I ran. The melody chased me through the marshes, twisting and warping into something monstrous. It wasn't music anymore. It was a scream, a cacophony of voices clawing at my mind. I reached the edge of the wetlands and saw it. A gnarled tree rising from the water, its bark blackened and twisted. The melody seemed to emanate from it, vibrating through the air like a pulse. With shaking hands, I struck another flare and hurled it at the tree. The flames caught instantly, racing up the trunk as the shadowman appeared at its base, writhing in agony. The song shifted into a final piercing wail before falling silent. I staggered back to the RV, half expecting it to still be dead, but when I turned the key, the engine roared to life. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the flames still burning in the distance. The melody was gone, but the silence it left behind was almost worse. Even now, I sometimes hear faint echoes of that song in the back of my mind, and when I do, I drive faster. My name is Grayson Richmond, and I'm 42 years old. This happened in late October 2022, during what should have been a routine stop for my freelance travel blog. I was in Big Bog State Recreation Area in northern Minnesota, researching for an article about hidden gems in the Midwest. I never expected it to be the last trip I'd take by myself or the one that would haunt me for the rest of my life. I arrived at Big Bog early in the afternoon, the crisp autumn air filling my lungs as I parked my rented RV in a secluded camping spot. It was off-season and I had the area almost entirely to myself. That's how I liked it. Quiet, peaceful, the perfect place to write and gather inspiration. The bog stretched out endlessly beyond the marked trails, a sprawling wilderness of tall grasses and mirror-like water. It was beautiful in its darkness, but there was something about it that made me uneasy. The park ranger I'd spoken to earlier, Joan, had warned me about sticking to the main trails. "This bog can be unforgiving," she'd said, her tone more serious than I expected. "Stay out of the deep areas, especially at night. You don't want to end up like the others." I'd laughed it off at the time, assuming she was trying to spook me, but the way her eyes lingered on mine, the lines on her face tightening, told me there might be more to her words than I realized. After setting up camp, I decided to explore one of the marked trails near the bog. My GPS was acting up, something about weak satellite signals, but the trail was well maintained, and I didn't think I needed it. The bog smelled of damp earth and decaying vegetation, and the silence was heavy, broken only by the occasional rustle of wind through the tall grass. About an hour in, I spotted something off the trail. It was subtle at first, just a break in the brush, but curiosity got the better of me. I pushed through the thicket and stumbled upon what looked like the ruins of an old homestead. A crumbling stone foundation was all that remained of the structure, half sunken into the marshy ground. Nearby, I found something that made my skin prickle. A rusted doll, its porcelain face cracked but still smiling, and a faded black and white photograph lying half buried in the dirt. The photo showed a family, a man, a woman, and 2 children standing in front of what must have been the same cabin, though intact and whole in the picture. There was something off about their expressions, though, especially the children. They weren't smiling like you'd expect. Their faces looked solemn, almost scared. A chill ran down my spine, but I brushed it off as a trick of the atmosphere. I slipped the photo into my jacket pocket for safekeeping. It would make for a great addition to my article, a piece of history tied to the bog's mysterious past. That night, as I sat in my RV typing notes, the first strange thing happened. The lights flickered briefly, and I heard a faint tapping on the window. At first, I thought it was just tree branches rushing against the glass, but when I stepped outside to check, there was nothing there. The trees were too far from the RV for anything to have reached it. I told myself it was just my imagination and went to bed. The next morning, I woke to find my laptop had died, despite being fully charged the night before. My phone's battery had drained too, and the generator was sputtering like it was on its last legs. It wasn't a huge deal. I could make do without technology for a while, but it was inconvenient. I decided to explore further, hoping to shake off the strange unease that had settled over me. As I walked deeper into the bog, a dense fog began to roll in, muffling the world around me. The silence was absolute, almost oppressive. That's when I heard it. Faint whispers, just on the edge of hearing. I stopped, straining to listen, but they faded as quickly as they'd come. "Hello?" I called out, feeling foolish as my voice broke the stillness. Of course, there was no response. I chalked it up to the wind playing tricks on me and kept walking. About halfway through the hike, I reached a clearing where the bog opened up into a shallow pool of water. The surface was so still, it looked like glass. As I stared at it, I thought I saw movement, a ripple, then a shadow, like something just beneath the surface. My heart thudded, but when I stepped closer, there was nothing there. When I got back to the RV that evening, I realized something unsettling. The doll I'd left near the ruins was now sitting on the steps of the RV. At first, I thought maybe I'd accidentally packed it with me, but the memory of leaving it behind was vivid. My hands trembled as I picked it up. It felt heavier than it should, as if it were waterlogged. I tossed it into a storage bin, trying not to think about it. That night, I had a dream, or at least I think it was a dream. I was standing in the ruined cabin, but it was whole again, the walls intact and the air thick with the smell of damp wood. The children from the photo were there, playing in the corner. They turned to look at me, their faces pale and expressionless. "Stay with us," one of them said in a soft, lilting voice. The other reached out her hand, cold and wet, like she had just pulled it from the fog. I woke up gasping, my clothes soaked with sweat. The RV felt stifling, as though the air had been sucked out of it. When I glanced at the window, I froze. There was a handprint on the glass, small and smudged like a child's. By the 4th day, I was ready to leave. My nerves were shot and the RV was barely functioning, but as I started packing, I felt an inexplicable pull to return to the cabin ruins. It was as if something was calling me, drawing me back. Against my better judgment, I went. The bog seemed darker than before, the air heavier. When I reached the ruins, the atmosphere was suffocating. I took out the photograph and held it up, studying the faces again. That's when I heard a voice, soft, melodic, but with an edge that made my skin crawl. "Grayson," it whispered. "Why did you come here?" I spun around, but no one was there. The shadows seemed to shift, though, coalescing into a figure. It was the mother from the photo, her face gaunt and hollow, her eyes like black pits. She stepped closer, and I realized I couldn't move. My limbs were frozen, my breath shallow. "You'll stay," she said, her voice echoing in my head. "You'll stay with us." A cold, suffocating presence washed over me, and I felt myself slipping. My mind blurred, and for a moment I was back in the cabin, the walls closing in around me. The children laughed, their voices sharp and cruel, their hands grabbing at me. In a desperate burst of will, I remembered the doll. I fumbled for it in my bag, pulling it out and hurling it into the ruins. The mother screamed, a horrible guttural sound that shook the ground. The shadows recoiled, and I felt the hold on me break. I ran. I didn't care about the trails or the fog. I ran until my legs burned and the RV came into sight. Throwing myself inside, I started the engine and drove, not even bothering to secure my things. The bog blurred behind me as I sped down the narrow road, not stopping until I reached a nearby gas station. To this day, I can't explain what happened. I left the photo and doll behind, but sometimes I still feel their presence, like shadows lingering at the edges of my vision. And at night, when the world is quiet, I swear I hear whispers. If you ever visit Big Bog, be careful. Some places don't want to let you go. My name is Emma Wells, and I'm 28 years old. This happened last October when I joined my two closest friends for what was supposed to be a simple camping trip in Big Bend National Park. At the time, it seemed like the perfect way to escape the noise of the city. Instead, it became the most terrifying experience of my life, one that still haunts me every time I close my eyes. It started with Jake, of course. He was too much of a thrill seeker to his core, always itching for the next adventure. "Big Bend is practically made for us," he'd said over the phone, pitching the idea like a salesman. "Hiking, stargazing, legends of ghosts and skinwalkers, it's got everything." Sam, the oldest at 31, was reluctant from the beginning. As a park ranger from another state, he had a respect for the wilderness that Jake never seemed to grasp. "This isn't some controlled trail in a state park," Sam warned. "If we're not careful, the Chisos Basin will chew us up and spit us out." I should have listened to him. We rented an old RV, the only one available on short notice, and drove for hours to the park. As soon as we hit the basin, I felt an uneasiness settle over me. The mountains rose like jagged teeth, their shadows stretching long and deep under the late afternoon sun. The isolation was palpable. No cell service, no sounds except the wind and the occasional call of a bird. The RV was already giving us trouble. The battery light flickered as we parked at the campsite, and the interior lights buzzed faintly. Jake waved it off, saying, "It'll hold. We're not driving anywhere for a few days anyway." That night, we sat around the fire, trading stories. Jake was in his element, weaving tales about the supernatural. "Skinwalkers," he said, grinning wickedly. "Shapeshifters. They mimic voices to lure you away from safety. People go missing out here all the time, you know." Sam shook his head. "That's Navajo folklore, not from around here." "Doesn't mean it can't happen," Jake shot back. I tried to laugh it off, but as the firelight danced across the surrounding trees, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The first sign came in the middle of the night. I woke to a sound outside the RV, a low, guttural cry that sent chills down my spine. It sounded like an animal at first, maybe a coyote, but then it shifted, rising into a scream that almost sounded human. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, shaking Jake awake. He groaned. "It's just the wind, Emma. Go back to sleep." But it didn't feel like the wind. The next morning I found tracks near the campsite. They were large, humanoid, but wrong, too deep, too elongated, with no visible tread or pattern. Sam frowned as he studied them. "Could be a bear," he said, though he didn't sound convinced. Jake, of course, was delighted. "It's the skinwalker," he declared dramatically. "We're being hunted." "Don't joke about that," Sam snapped. We set off on a hike later that day, hoping to shake off the tension. The Chisos Mountains were breathtaking, with rugged peaks and sprawling desert views, but the further we went, the quieter the forest became. No birds, no rustling leaves, just an oppressive, unnatural silence. As we made our way back to the RV, I heard someone call my name. "Emma," the voice said, soft and clear, coming from the woods to our left. I stopped in my tracks. "Jake?" I asked, turning to him. "What?" he said, walking right beside me. The voice called again. "Emma." My blood ran cold. It was my name, but it didn't sound quite right, like someone trying to imitate it and failing, just enough to be unsettling. "We need to go," Sam said, his voice low and urgent. That night, the RV felt like a prison. The battery was completely dead, leaving us with no lights except for a few weak flashlights. The fire outside barely seemed to keep the darkness at bay. Jake tried to lighten the mood, but even he seemed unnerved. The scratching started around midnight. At first it was faint, like branches brushing against the RV, but then it grew louder, more deliberate. Something or someone was clawing at the door. "Stay quiet," Sam whispered, his face pale. He grabbed the fire poker and stood by the door. We held our breath as the scratching stopped. A moment later, a voice called from outside. "Sam," it said, perfectly mimicking Jake. Sam froze. "Don't answer it," he hissed. Then it called again, this time mimicking me. "Emma, let me in." Jake was the first to break. "What the hell is out there?" he demanded, moving toward the door. "Don't," Sam warned, but Jake was already reaching for the handle. Before he could open it, a shadow passed across the small window. It was humanoid, but hunched, its limbs too long, its movement jerky and unnatural. The firelight outside caught its face, and I felt bile rise in my throat. It was trying to look human, but the features were twisted, stretched, wrong. Jake stumbled back, his bravado gone. "What do we do?" he whispered. Sam gripped the fire poker tightly. "We wait. It'll leave if we don't give it what it wants." But the thing outside didn't leave. It circled the RV, tapping on the windows, its distorted voice calling out in turn for each of us. Every time it spoke, it sounded more grotesque, more inhuman. I felt the walls closing in. "We can't just sit here," I said, panic rising in my chest. Sam looked at me, his expression grim. "If we run, it'll pick us off one by one. We stay together." But the RV wasn't safe. The roof creaked under the weight of something heavy. The clawing returned, more frenzied this time. I clutched my camera, desperate for some sense of control. Without thinking, I snapped a photo of the window. The flash lit up the darkness, and for a split second, I saw it. The creature was perched just outside, its hollow eyes staring back at me. I screamed, and the thing let out a guttural shriek, retreating into the shadows. By dawn, the scratching had stopped, but the RV was in shambles. Deep claw marks scored the doors and windows. Sam made the call. We had to leave. The RV was no longer an option, so we packed what we could and set off on foot toward the nearest campsite. The fog was thick, muffling sounds and making it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. Every rustle of leaves, every shadow made my heart race. We were halfway down the trail when it struck. The creature burst from the trees, a blur of limbs and claws. It went straight for Sam, knocking him to the ground. "Run!" he yelled, swinging the fire poker wildly. "Sam!" I screamed, but Jake grabbed my arm and dragged me forward. Sam's screams echoed behind us, then fell abruptly silent. Jake and I stumbled into the next campsite hours later, bloodied and shaken. A group of hikers called for help, but by the time the rangers arrived, there was no sign of Sam or the creature. The official report listed him as missing, but I know the truth. Something ancient, something evil, took him in those mountains, and it's still out there, watching, waiting. I haven't gone camping since. My name is Joseph Foreman. I'm 37 years old, and this happened in the summer of 2021 during what was supposed to be a quiet camping trip to the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness in northern Minnesota. It was meant to be a simple getaway, a few days in the wild with my younger brother Orion and my college friend Sam. I thought I'd shake off the stress of my job, reconnect with nature, and spend quality time with people I loved. Instead, it became a nightmare I can't shake. It started like most trips do, full of optimism and plans. I'd booked the permits months in advance and mapped out a route to a remote lake called Dead Man's Mirror. The name alone should have been a red flag, but I brushed it off. I'd read about the eerie folklore surrounding the place, sure, but I thought of it as nothing more than ghost stories designed to scare tourists. The reality was the lake was far enough off the beaten path that I knew it would be peaceful. That's all I wanted, peace. Ryan, 29, was skeptical from the start. Dead man's mirror? He laughed as we drove up Highway 61. You're really leaning into the horror movie vibe here, huh? He was sprawled across the passenger seat, lazily scrolling through his phone. Relax, I said, my hands gripping the wheel. It's just a name. The lake's supposed to be gorgeous. In the backseat, Sam, 31, chimed in. Honestly, I love it. I'm ready for some creepy vibes. Bring on the ghosts. She sounded cheerful, then eager. I wish I could have bottled that enthusiasm before things went sideways. The first 2 days were uneventful enough. We paddled through glassy lakes, the only sounds the dip of our oars and the occasional call of a loon. The weather was perfect, blue skies, cool breezes. Even the portages, which I usually dreaded, felt manageable. But the wilderness has a way of shifting its mood. It started on the second night. We'd set up camp at a clearing near Dead Man's Mirror, a lake that lived up to its name with its unnaturally smooth surface. Not a single ripple broke its mirror-like stillness, even though the breeze stirred the surrounding pines. Sam joked that it looked like a portal to another world. That night, after we'd finished a dinner of freeze-dried chili and marshmallows, we sat around the fire sharing ghost stories. Sam told us about the Wendigo, a creature from Ojibwe folklore that preyed on those lost in the wilderness, driving them mad before devouring them. As she spoke, the wind picked up, rustling the trees in a way that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It felt deliberate. Okay, enough of that, Ryan said, tossing another log onto the fire. We're scaring ourselves over nothing. But later that night, as I lay in my old tent, I heard footsteps. They were light, almost cautious, circling the camp. My first thought was deer, but these footsteps didn't have the uneven rhythm of an animal. They were deliberate, human. I froze, holding my breath, straining to hear more. The fire outside had died down, leaving the camp bathed in darkness. I wanted to call out to Ryan or Sam, but something stopped me, an instinct I couldn't explain. The footsteps stopped, and the silence that followed was worse. The next day, I didn't mention the footsteps. Maybe I was being paranoid, I told myself. Maybe it was just the forest playing tricks on me. But the forest felt different. The air was heavier, the light dimmer, even though there wasn't a cloud in the sky. As we portaged our canoe to another section of the lake, Sam suddenly stumbled, falling hard onto her knees. Are you okay? I rushed to help her up. Her face was pale. I'm fine, She stopped, staring into the trees. Did you see that? See what? Ryan asked, brushing pine needles off her jacket. She hesitated. I thought I saw someone over there. She pointed to the dense forest where the shadows were too thick to make out anything. Ryan rolled his eyes. It's just the trees, Sam. Relax. But I couldn't shake the feeling that she was right. That evening, things escalated. We were sitting around the fire again, trying to keep things light, when I noticed a fox at the edge of the clearing. At first, it seemed normal enough, just standing there, its orange fur glowing faintly in the firelight. But as I watched, I realized it wasn't moving. It was staring at us, unblinking, for far too long. Ryan tried to scare it off, shouting and waving his arms. The fox didn't flinch. It just turned and disappeared into the woods. That was weird, Sam said, hugging her knees to her chest. I nodded, my stomach churning. That night, the footsteps returned. This time, they were louder, more deliberate. I could hear them circling not just my tent, but the entire camp. And then a voice, Joseph. It was faint, almost a whisper, but unmistakable. My blood turned to ice. Joseph, come here. I bolted upright, my hands trembling as I unzipped the tent. The camp was empty, except for the dying embers of the fire. I scanned the clearing, my flashlight trembling in my hand, but nothing moved. The forest was silent again, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. The next morning, I told Ryan and Sam what I'd heard. That's it, Sam said, her voice shaking. I want to leave today. Seriously? Ryan scoffed. It's just the wilderness messing with your head. We're fine. We're not fine, Sam snapped. Something's out there, Ryan. Something's watching us. I didn't want to believe her, but deep down I knew she was right. By the time we packed up camp and started paddling back, the wilderness seemed to conspire against us. A thick fog rolled in, oh so dense we could barely see the shoreline. The compass I'd brought spun uselessly, its needle twitching erratically. "We're going in circles," I said, my voice tight with panic. "No, we're not," Ryan argued, but he didn't sound convinced. The shoreline shifted as though the lake was alive, rearranging itself to trap us. Every time we thought we were making progress, we'd end up back at the same spot. That's when we heard the laughter. It was faint at first, carried on the wind, but it grew louder, closer, until it was unmistakable, children's laughter echoing across the water. "There's no one out here," Sam whispered, her face pale. The laughter stopped abruptly, leaving an oppressive silence, and then the whispers began. By nightfall, we'd given up trying to escape. Exhausted and terrified, we set up camp at the same clearing we'd started from. The forest came alive around us. Shadows moved at the edges of the firelight, shapes too large and too fluid to be animals. A low growl echoed from somewhere deep in the woods, and then we saw it. At first, it looked like a man, tall and gaunt, standing just beyond the firelight. But as it stepped closer, its shape shifted. Its limbs grew longer, its face stretching into something inhuman. Its eyes were hollow, glowing faintly with an unnatural light. Sam screamed, and Ryan grabbed the hatchet we'd brought for firewood, brandishing it uselessly. The creature didn't attack. It just stood there, watching us, tilting its head like a curious animal. I remembered the legend Sam had told by the fire, the Wendigo, a creature that preyed on fear, feeding on the weak and desperate. I had to do something. In a moment of desperation, I grabbed my camera, the one thing I'd brought to document the trip, and hurled it into the lake. The creature paused, its glowing eyes following the splash for a moment. The forest was silent. Then it retreated into the shadows, disappearing as quickly as it had appeared. We didn't sleep that night. At the first light of dawn, we paddled furiously, not stopping until we reached the ranger station. The ranger listened to our story without a hint of surprise. When we finished, he nodded grimly. "You're lucky it let you go," he said. "It's been over a year since that trip, and I still hear the whispers sometimes late at night when I'm alone. I feel its eyes on me. I know it's waiting." My name is Penelope Jacobs, and I was 31 when this happened in late October 2022. I've always considered myself a rational person. As a freelance journalist, I've spent years chasing stories about ghosts, cryptids, and haunted places. Most of the time, these stories amount to nothing but overactive imaginations or cleverly planted hoaxes. That's what I thought would happen when I decided to investigate Devil's Hollow. I'd first heard about the place from a Reddit thread on urban legends in Wisconsin and Minnesota. The name popped up several times, an abandoned section of Black River State Forest where hikers reported strange symbols carved into trees, unnatural noises, and even sightings of a horned figure. Locals said it was cursed, that rituals had been performed there long ago to summon something dark. I wanted to write a feature on modern-day folklore, and Devil's Hollow seemed like the perfect subject. It wasn't far from where I was staying, and I had my RV, so I could camp overnight to immerse myself in the story. What I didn't realize was that I wouldn't leave that hollow the same person I was when I arrived. I parked my RV at the end of a dirt trail that was barely visible through the thick trees. The forest was quiet, too quiet. There were no birds, no rustling leaves, just the faint whisper of the wind and the creak of the trees. I grabbed my gear, a flashlight, camera, and notebook, and set off toward the hollow. The trail was narrow and overgrown, the ground soft and damp beneath my boots. As I walked, I noticed the trees seemed to lean inward, their gnarled branches reaching toward each other like skeletal fingers. The deeper I went, the heavier the air became, as though the forest itself was pressing down on me. After about an hour, I found it, a small clearing with a moss-covered stone altar at its center. The altar looked ancient, its surface blackened by scorch marks. Around it, the ground was barren, as though nothing dared to grow there. Strange symbols were carved into the stone, spirals, triangles, and shapes that looked almost like runes. I snapped a few photos, making careful notes about the markings. That's when I heard it. At first I thought it was the wind, but as I listened, I realized it was something else. Chanting, faint and low, carried on the breeze. It seemed to come from deeper in the forest, though I couldn't see anyone. My heart raced, but I told myself it was just my imagination or maybe the sound of distant hikers. I spent a couple of hours exploring the area, documenting claw-like marks on nearby trees and scorch patterns on the rocks. Just as the sun started to dip below the horizon, I stumbled across something buried near the altar. A weathered, leather-bound diary. Its cover was damp, the pages stained and yellowed with age, but the words inside were still legible. The entries were written by a man named John, who had camped in Devil's Hollow decades ago. At first, he described it as a place of eerie beauty, but as the days went on, his tone grew frantic. He wrote about hearing whispers at night, seeing shadowy figures in the trees, and feeling an oppressive presence watching him. One of the last entries read, "The spiral marks, the place of power. I can't escape it. It watches from the trees. I hear it breathing." I felt a chill crawl down my spine. The spiral. I looked back at the altar, at the markings carved into the stone, and wondered if John had seen the same thing. The chanting was louder now, closer, and it was enough to send me hurrying back to the RV. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I locked the doors, drew the curtains, and tried to focus on transcribing my notes. But then the lights flickered, even though the generator was running fine. A faint hum filled the air, and my radio crackled to life, playing snippets of distorted voices. I turned it off, but the noise didn't stop. Outside, the motion detector light flickered on. My stomach clenched as I peeked out the window. The clearing was empty, or so it seemed. Just as I turned away, I saw it. A shadowy figure standing at the edge of the trees. It was tall and thin, its shape almost human, but its arms were too long, and its head had the distinct curve of horns. It didn't move. It just stood there, watching. My heart pounded in my chest as I grabbed my flashlight and knife. I didn't want to go outside, but something inside me, a mix of fear and defiance, made me step out. The figure was gone, but when I shone the flashlight on a nearby tree, I saw a fresh carving, a spiral, dripping with a black tar-like substance. I stumbled back into the RV, locking the door behind me. That night, I didn't sleep. I stayed up clutching my knife, jumping at every creak and groan of the RV. The next morning, I knew I had to leave, but before I could pack up, I felt an inexplicable pull to go back to the altar. It was as though something was compelling me, drawing me in against my better judgment. I grabbed the diary and my camera and headed back into the forest. When I reached the altar, the air was even colder than before. My breath came out in visible puffs, and the chanting had returned, louder than ever. The spiral markings on the altar seemed to pulse, glowing faintly in the dim light. Then I felt it, a presence, heavy and suffocating. I turned, and there it was, the horned figure, standing just beyond the clearing. Its body was skeletal, its skin stretched taut over its frame. The horns curved like a ram's, and its hollow eyes glowed with a faint, dead, sickly light. It didn't move, but I felt its malice like a physical weight. It spoke, but not aloud. The words echoed in my mind, low and guttural. "You have trespassed. This place is mine. You will offer something of value, or you will not leave." I was paralyzed, my legs refusing to move. The diary slipped from my hands and landed on the altar. The horned figure tilted its head, as though amused. I don't know what gave me the idea. Maybe it was desperation, or maybe something in the diary had planted the seed. But I grabbed my lighter and set the pages on fire. The flames consumed the book quickly, and as they did, the chanting stopped. The figure let out a deafening roar, its form flickering like smoke. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I ran back to the RV, my lungs burning, my heart pounding in my chest. As I drove away, the RV shook violently, as though something was trying to force its way inside. The lights flickered, and the radio crackled with static. But I didn't stop. Not until I was miles away in the safety of a brightly lit gas station parking lot. It's been weeks since I left Devil's Hollow, but the memories still haunt me. The photos I took of the altar and the spiral symbols made their way into my article, sparking debates and wild theories online. But I didn't include everything. I didn't write about the horned figure or the whispers, or how I can still feel its presence even now. Sometimes late at night, I wake up to find the spiral symbol scratched into my walls, and I know it's not over. The hollow never lets you go. My name is David Dudley, and I'm 38 years old. This happened in late February, deep in the swamps of Big Cypress National Preserve in Florida. I'd driven my RV into the wilderness looking for isolation and a chance to test my survival skills. I didn't go there for the peace or the beauty. I went to prove that I could live off the land, just me against nature. What I found instead wasn't nature. It was something darker, something I still can't fully explain. I arrived at Big Cypress early in the morning, the mist still clinging to the trees. My RV rattled over the rough dirt road, bouncing with every pothole. I finally found a clearing near the edge of the swamp, shaded by towering cypress trees draped in Spanish moss. It was perfect, remote, quiet, and miles away from the nearest person. I parked, unloaded my gear, and set up camp. My plan was simple: spend 2 weeks out here, relying on my skills and instincts. I had basic supplies, some canned food, a water filter, and a few tools, but I wanted to rely mostly on what I could catch or forage. I wasn't worried. I'd done this before. By late afternoon, the swamp came alive. Birds called from the trees, frogs croaked in the distance, and the faint hum of insects filled the air. It felt like stepping into another world. But as I finished setting up camp, I noticed something odd: large hoof prints in the soft mud near my RV. They were too big to be from a deer and too deep to belong to a boar. I stared at them for a while, then shrugged it off. Big Cypress was home to all sorts of animals, and I figured it was nothing to worry about. That night, the swamp was eerily quiet. I sat by my campfire, jotting notes in my journal about the day. I was about to turn in when I heard it, a deep, resonant sound like the rumble of a distant drum. It came from somewhere in the swamp, low and rhythmic. I froze, straining to listen, but the sound faded as quickly as it had started. I told myself it was just the wind or the creak of trees shifting in the breeze. I didn't want to admit it, but it left me uneasy. When I crawled into bed, I locked the RV door. I don't usually do that. There's nothing out here that I can't handle. But that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The next few days were more unsettling. On the second morning, I noticed that some of my supplies were missing: a few cans of food, a small hatchet, and my fishing line. I knew I hadn't misplaced them, and there was no sign of anyone else nearby. But the hoof prints were back, this time circling the RV. They were deeper now, like something heavy had been pacing around my camp. The swamp itself seemed different too. The birds that had been so noisy on the first day were silent, and the air felt heavier, more oppressive. I kept brushing off the feeling of being watched, but it was getting harder to ignore. On the fourth night, I heard the sound again, the drumming, louder this time and closer. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside. The fire had burned down to embers, casting long shadows across the trees. I scanned the swamp, but saw nothing. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I caught a glimpse of movement, a flash of something tall and dark disappearing into the trees. "Who's there?" I called, my voice steadier than I felt. No answer, just the faint rustle of leaves. I stood there for what felt like an eternity before retreating to the RV and locking the door again. The next day, I went deeper into the swamp, determined to find answers. I followed the hoof prints, which led me to a clearing I hadn't seen before. In the center stood a crumbling stone altar, half buried in the muck. It was adorned with animal bones, skulls, ribs, antlers, all arranged in a way that felt deliberate. The carvings on the altar were faded but intricate, depicting swirling shapes that seemed to shift if I stared too long. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I wasn't superstitious, but something about this place felt wrong. I backed away, intending to leave, when I noticed fresh hoof prints leading away from the altar. They were impossibly large, almost like they'd been made by some kind of monstrous animal. That night the black stag appeared. It was just beyond the edge of the firelight, its glowing red eyes piercing the darkness. Its massive antlers seemed to stretch into the night sky, and its dark, sinewy body glistened as if wet. It didn't move, just stared, its presence heavy and suffocating. I don't know how long I sat there frozen. Eventually it turned and melted into the shadows without a sound. That night I dreamed of the black stag. In the dream, it stood at the edge of my campfire, speaking in a voice that was both deep and resonant, like the rumble of thunder. "You've wandered too far," it said, its voice echoing in my head. "This is my domain. You can leave or you can stay and be consumed." I woke, drenched in sweat. The fire had burned out and the RV was colder than it had any right to be. When I stepped outside, I found hoofprints circling the camp again, closer this time, almost touching the edge of the fire pit. I decided I had to leave. I packed up what little I could, but when I tried to start the RV, the engine sputtered and died. I checked the battery. It was completely drained, though it had been fully charged the day before. That night, the black stag returned. This time, it stepped into the light of the fire. It was even more terrifying up close, its fur matted and black, its eyes glowing like embers. It towered over me, and when it spoke, its voice echoed through the swamp. "You cannot leave without offering something in return." "What do you want?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Your freedom," it said. I didn't know what that meant, but I wasn't about to give it anything. Instead, I grabbed my lighter and ran to the altar. I doused it in fuel and set it ablaze. The flames roared to life, consuming the bones and carvings. The black stag let out an unearthly roar, its form twisting and writhing before it dissolved into the shadows. The oppressive weight lifted, and for the first time in days, the swamp felt alive again. The next morning, the RV started on the first try. I drove out of Big Cypress as fast as the dirt road would let me, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly they ached. I haven't told anyone about what happened, not fully. Sometimes when I'm alone, I still hear the drumming sound, faint and distant. And when I close my eyes, I see those glowing red eyes watching me from the darkness. My name is Joseph Livingston, and I was 18 when this happened in the summer of 2018. At the time, I thought the worst part of the trip would be being stuck in the middle of nowhere with my family and no Wi-Fi. Turns out I was wrong. So wrong. What happened in Chippewa National Forest wasn't just weird, it was terrifying. It started with Dad's brilliant idea to take us camping. He wanted to reconnect as a family, which meant cramming me, my 7-year-old brother Ethan, and Mom into our RV and heading to the woods. Dad's name is Tom, by the way. He's a former Boy Scout who still believes duct tape and a multi-tool can fix anything. Mom, Sarah, was less enthusiastic about the trip, though she didn't say much. She had this way of pursing her lips when she was worried, and they were tight as piano strings. From the moment we left, we drove hours into the forest, farther than I thought was necessary. It was hot, sticky, and smelled like pine sap and mildew. Eventually, we found this clearing off some barely there dirt road. There were no other campers, no ranger station, just trees and silence. Dad clapped his hands. "Perfect spot." I rolled my eyes. "Perfectly creepy, you mean?" "Come on, Joseph," he said. "It's an adventure." Ethan was already bouncing around, excited to explore. That's my little brother, quiet one second, full of energy the next. I helped unpack while Dad fiddled with the generator, which kept sputtering and dying. He muttered something about needing to tinker with it later. That first night I couldn't sleep, not because of the crickets or the distant rustling, but because of the weird, heavy feeling in the air. It pressed on me like a weight on my chest. I told myself I was being paranoid. It was just the isolation, right? But then Mom, who was always calm, woke up around midnight and just sat there, staring out the RV window like she was listening for something. The next day, Ethan found the doll. It was mid-morning, and we were setting up a fire pit when Ethan came running out of the woods, holding this small, handmade figure. It was a creepy thing, just a few twigs tied together with bits of fabric, but it had this unsettling human shape. "Look what I found," he said, smiling like he'd found treasure. "I'm going to call him Silas." Mom froze. "Where did you find that?" Ethan pointed to the edge of the forest by the big tree over there. Mom tried to take the doll from him, but Ethan clutched it tightly. "No, Silas is mine," he said. Dad laughed it off. "It's just a doll, Sarah. Let him have his fun." Mom didn't argue, But later, when she thought no one was looking, I saw her burying a similar doll she'd found near the fire pit. I didn't think much of it at the time. That night, things got worse. It started with the noises, soft laughter, like kids playing, except it was coming from the woods, and it was way past dark. I thought maybe I was dreaming until I saw Mom sit bolt upright. She shook Dad awake. "Tom, listen," she whispered. Dad rubbed his eyes. "It's just animals." "Animals don't laugh," she shot back. I pressed my ear to the RV wall and heard it too, high-pitched giggles and rustling leaves, like someone or something was running just outside. Dad grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside despite Mom's protests. I peeked out the window as he swept the beam around. Nothing. "It's fine. Go back to sleep," he called. But it wasn't fine. The next morning, I noticed deep scratches on the RV's side, like claw marks. Dad brushed it off as a raccoon or something, but I wasn't convinced. Neither was Mom. That's when she started telling us about the stories her grandmother used to tell about spirits that lured children into the woods. "They mimic laughter," she said. "Voices. They trick you." Dad scoffed. "You're scaring the kids." But Mom wasn't trying to scare us. She was scared herself. Ethan, on the other hand, didn't seem bothered. He spent the day playing with Silas and humming a strange tune I'd never heard before. When I asked him about it, he just shrugged. "Silas taught it to me." I laughed nervously. "Sure he did." By the third night, I was ready to leave. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The air was too still, too quiet, except for Ethan's humming. He'd been humming that same tune all day, and it was driving me nuts. "Ethan, can you stop?" I snapped. He didn't even look at me. "Silas says we're going to play hide and seek tonight." And that gave me chills. "Who's we?" I asked. "The other kids," he said simply, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. Mom shot Dad a look. "We're leaving tomorrow." Dad sighed. "Sarah, it's just a phase. He's using his imagination." "Tom, something isn't right." That night, Ethan disappeared. We had just finished dinner when I realized he wasn't in the RV. I panicked, shouting his name as we searched the campsite. That's when we found the doll Silas, lying at the forest edge, smeared with sticky black sap. Mom picked it up, and her hands started trembling. "He's in the woods," she whispered. We grabbed flashlights and ventured in, calling Ethan's name. The trees closed in around us, the air thick with that oppressive heaviness. And then we heard it, the laughter, high-pitched giggles, just ahead. I ran toward it, but Mom yanked me back. "Stay together," she hissed. The laughter grew louder, and we saw them, a ring of pale children standing in a clearing. Their eyes were empty, like they weren't really looking at us. Ethan was standing in the center, holding hands with one of them. The child next to him was skeletal, its body twisted unnaturally, like it had been shaped from wood. "Ethan," Mom cried, stepping forward. The children turned to us in unison, their heads jerking unnaturally. My legs turned to jelly. Ethan didn't react. He just stood there, staring ahead, humming that eerie tune. "Let him go," Mom shouted. One of the children spoke, but its voice was hollow and wrong, like multiple voices layered together. "He belongs to the forest now." Dad aimed his flashlight at them, and for a moment, the light revealed their true forms, decayed, rotting bodies, their skin stretched thin over bones. The skeletal child smiled, its jaw unhinging wider than it should have. I wanted to run, but Mom grabbed my arm. "We're not leaving without him." She knelt, clutching the doll in her hands. "Take this," she whispered. "Take Silas back and let him go." The children didn't move, but their hollow eyes seemed to narrow. "Burn it," I said suddenly, my voice shaking. "Burn the doll." Mom hesitated, but Dad pulled out a lighter and set the doll ablaze. The children screamed, a piercing, otherworldly sound that echoed through the trees. Ethan collapsed, and the children dissolved into the shadows, leaving behind a towering figure at the edge of the clearing, the Wendigo. It was skeletal, with antlers sprouting from its head and glowing, hollow eyes that burned into my soul. It let out a guttural growl and stepped toward us. Dad fired a flare gun, and the creature recoiled, its form flickering like smoke. We didn't wait. Grabbing Ethan, we ran back to the RV and didn't stop until we reached the nearest ranger station. We never saw the Wendigo again, but we didn't need to. It's still out there, waiting. Ethan doesn't talk about what happened. He says he doesn't remember. But sometimes I catch him humming that tune, And every time I feel the weight of the forest pressing down on me, like it's still watching, because I know it is.